All right, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your attention to today's proceedings. We have with us, to end this conference, two truly great scholars. Everyone is a great scholar. Michael Scammel has a special place, at least for me. I got to know Michael Scammel's work when he was the editor of the Index on Censorship and founded the Index on Censorship back in the 70s, I think, in the early 70s, and was one of the great movers of the dissident movies, the Tamistat, frankly, movement, but also facilitating the publication of a vast amount of Soviet dissident writing in the 70s. Mr. Scammel is the author most recently of a biography of Arthur Koestler, Koestler, The Literary and Political Odyssey of a 20th Century Skeptic, and as I'm sure everyone knows, he wrote the biography of Solzhenitsyn. And so, Michael.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patience. I will try to be brief. I promise to be brief. I'd like to start with a couple of disclaimers. I should tell you that I did the research and wrote my biography of Solzhenitsyn many years ago, in fact, from 1972 to 1982. And then, as many of you may know, I spent far too long working on my biography of Arthur Koestler and writing it. And during the time of working on Arthur Koestler, I did not really think a great deal about Solzhenitsyn. And so I'm here as that biographer, but not as a recent scholar of Solzhenitsyn or his works. In fact, my biography ended soon after the Harvard speech, and long before Solzhenitsyn went back to Russia, and long before he started publishing the works that have caused, I think, the most controversy since, and also works during which he revealed a rather different side of himself from the one, I think, that I portrayed. So I was invited as a biographer, and my approach is going to be as a biographer. This is not an academic paper. There are no implied footnotes, and I'm actually assuming a fairly good knowledge of the audience, on the part of the audience, of Solzhenitsyn's life and work, and some of the other people I will mention. Well, I have been thinking about the title of this talk. Oh, I better keep my promise. The title of this talk, ever since I was invited to give the talk on Solzhenitsyn and anti-Semitism. And my immediate response, whether it's correct or not, but I'm acting on it, is, in fact, behind this title, there was a question. And that question is, was Solzhenitsyn anti-Semitic? And if he was, to what degree? I'm not sure I can answer the second part of that. But I want to approach this question, I'm sorry, I see this question as arising above all in response to his highly controversial book that he published in 2001 and 2002, 200 Years Together. One might wonder whether together or apart is what comes out of his book, but in any case, that was the title of the book. And the controversy, of course, that erupted in response to his treatment, particularly of the Jews and their role in Russia. Well, for reasons that I hope to make clear, I'll actually turn away from that blunt question to begin with and approach the subject in a roundabout fashion by asking and answering a different question, which I think is related to it. And that is, I phrased it in a rather lengthy sentence. Why would a world-famous Russian author of dozens of books, including a multi-volume epic series of historical novels, The Red Wheel, stretching to thousands of pages about the First World War and the October Revolution, decide to spend 12 years towards the end of his life writing a 2-volume work about the Russian Jews? In fact, to me, that is a very interesting question. I will try and define an answer by examining certain episodes in his life, bit early for that, related to anti-Semitism. So I'll begin by pointing out that Solzhenitsyn grew up in the spa town of Stavropol in the North Caucasus, and by the way, his own centenary is in December, so that he is actually, his life is coterminous with Russia since the revolution. As many of you will know, it was a very conservative region in southern Russia, which generally supported the whites during the Civil War and kept them in power until 1920. By then, Solzhenitsyn was a 3-year-old orphan. His father, Isaki, by the way, that's not a Jewish name, but an old Orthodox Russian name, had died in a hunting accident before he was born, and he was brought up by his mother, Taisia, and an aunt, Irina, both of whom were extremely religious in their temperament and in their lives. When he was 7, they moved to the city of Rostov-on-Don, where the young Solzhenitsyn attended one of the better schools in the city. However, he was estranged from most of the other children for the single reason, or the main reason being, that encouraged by Taisia and Irina, he still wore a cross around his neck. And when he was 10, a group of jeering young pioneers ripped it from his neck. The Young Pioneers was a sort of Boy Scout movement, if you like, except that they were not independent, but a youth arm of the Communist Party. And at Solzhenitsyn's school, a majority of the Young Pioneers were Jewish. At a school meeting after that event, Solzhenitsyn was ridiculed for keeping himself apart from the other boys, but at the same time was exhorted to join the Young Pioneers himself and become, as it were, one of the boys. It took him another 2 years to do so, but that wasn't the end of his problems. One day, 2 boys in his class got into a fight and started getting insults at one another. One was a Russian, the other Jewish. And the Russian boy called the Jewish boy something along the lines of a dirty slob. I've forgotten the Russian for that insult now. The Jewish boy accused the Russian of anti-Semitism and asked Solzhenitsyn, who was standing nearby, to back him up. Solzhenitsyn refused, saying, quote, "Everyone has the right to say what he likes," unquote. This led to a special meeting of the Young Pioneers where Solzhenitsyn was reprimanded and accused of anti-Semitism. Well, in many ways, it was a typical spat between boisterous 12-year-olds. Certainly, those kind of insults are often hurled without huge, without a huge racial background, let's say. But it clearly rankled Solzhenitsyn and touched him very deeply, because he returned to this episode in the first circle, in the curious form of a flashback in the mind, not of a Russian, but of Adam Reutemann, a Jewish major in the NKVD. The Solzhenitsyn figure in the book is called Oleg Rozhdestvinsky, quote, "a pale boy who was top of his class, never talked about politics, and had joined the pioneers with obvious reluctance." That is, this is Solzhenitsyn himself. He has been seen going to church with his mother, wearing a cross, and is expelled from the Young Pioneers, this is in the novel, for saying, everybody has the right to say what he thinks. The story follows the real-life incident closely, but the punishment in the novel is harsher than in real life, and Reutemann, one of his accusers, is growing up to be the major in the NKVD who appears in the novel. The first circle was later analyzed for elements of anti-Semitism, but the analysis is not totally persuasive. One of Solzhenitsyn's two closest friends in the labor camp in real life was Lev Kopylov, a Jewish Marxist professor of literature who is portrayed extremely positively as Lev Rubin in the first circle. It's a curious fact that Solzhenitsyn consulted Kopylov intensively about revolutionary politics when they were together in the Gulag for a novel that Solzhenitsyn was writing at the time, and this is little known, called Love the Revolution. Now, it's not entirely clear, and I didn't find any clear evidence as to whether this title is very ironic, slightly ironic. I don't think it's entirely unnuanced, if you like, but nevertheless, Solzhenitsyn was heavily preoccupied with the revolution at that time. Well, now I'm going to jump to 1969 and Solzhenitsyn's visit to the editorial office of the liberal magazine Novy Mir, New World, in the summer of 1969. Oh, sorry, I've already said that. Novy Mir was the magazine that had taken the risk of publishing Solzhenitsyn's A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, Matryona's Place, and other short stories at a time they were considered risky and extremely daring. Solzhenitsyn's chief ally at the magazine, apart from its editor Alexander Twardovsky, was the critic Vladimir Lakshin, who was involved in a fierce public polemic with a reactionary critic at a conservative magazine called Molodaya Gvardia. A magazine, Molodaya Gvardia, which means Young Guard, and the writer for that magazine was Viktor Chalmayev. In one of his articles, Chalmayev had denounced the West as hopelessly corrupt and degenerate, choking on its own hate, the fount of all evil. The Russian tradition, on the other hand, he wrote, was pure and exalted, fed by, quote, a sacred spring. Russia should reform itself by turning back to its roots, drawing inspiration from the Russian village and the moral and spiritual values of the Russian people. Now, this is in 1969, at the height of Soviet rule, and it was extraordinary that an orthodox conservative magazine would publish such things. Chalmayev went further. He praised the values of Holy Russia and its saints and claimed that this Russian tradition had culminated in the Russian Revolution, believe it or not, which was, according to Chalmayev, a sacramental act. The liberals' name for this old-fashioned Russian chauvinism at the time with Slavophile overtones was National Bolshevism. And Lakshin, in his attack on Chalmayev, compared it to the ideology of the Black Hundreds at Tsarist times, an organization, as we've heard already, an organization notorious for its anti-Semitism and incitement of pogroms. Solzhenitsyn had just started August 1914 at that point, the first novel in his series, The Red Wheel, which, with its patriotic portrayal of Russia before and during World War I, put him, in effect, put him in a surprising place. To Lakshin's and Twardovsky's amazement, Solzhenitsyn pulled out a sheet of paper from his pocket, listing all the points on which he agreed with Chalmayev. He endorsed Chalmayev's appeal to Russian as opposed to Soviet patriotism. He praised the early Russian church, and he endorsed the praise for the early Russian church and its saints, and Chalmayev's reverence for the uniqueness of the Russian tradition. And he also agreed with Chalmayev's disdain of the West. He did not agree, of course, that the revolution had been a culmination and a sacramental act, nor did he admire Chalmayev's cheap journalistic prose or extremes of xenophobia. Nevertheless, already then in 1969, he thought Chalmayev was on the right track. Well, I mentioned this because clearly there was something in the air at the end of the 1960s. For at just about that time, Andrei Sakharov published his memorandum, Reflections on Progress, Peaceful Coexistence, and Intellectual Freedom. And Sakharov, of course, came from a very different tradition from Solzhenitsyn. But Sakharov, too, reflected on the Soviet Union's future, and unlike Chalmayev, expressed admiration for Western democracy. This prompted Kessler I've written, isn't that awful? Solzhenitsyn, that's where my mind has been. This prompted, I better make a note of that. This prompted Solzhenitsyn to write to Sakharov privately, welcoming him as an ally, but respectfully questioning Sakharov's pro-Western and pro-democracy sentiments. Quote, "We," meaning Russia, "have quite a different principle of government. That is, authoritarian rule," wrote Solzhenitsyn, which, quote, "can have nothing in common with Western democracy," unquote. I don't know if Sakharov responded at all to Solzhenitsyn. If he did, his letter would have been private, like Solzhenitsyn's own. And it seems it did not necessarily require an answer. Soon after that, soon after he had privately written to Sakharov, he also privately sent him another letter containing an advanced draft of an essay that would become Letter to the Leaders, which when published would become his most important public statement to date. The title of Part 1 spoke for itself. The West is on its knees. The West, wrote Solzhenitsyn, was in a state of collapse, whereas the Soviet Union was at the peak of its power. And since the doctrine of material progress was a myth, Russia should radically reform or abstain from communism, abandon ideology, and return to its roots, which did not include democracy. Russia had, quote, "a 1,000-year-old authoritarian order that had preserved the physical and spiritual health of her people intact," unquote, and, quote, "a strong moral foundation rooted in the Orthodox Church." The point of mentioning this is that Solzhenitsyn had arrived at positions far to the right of where people thought he was, much earlier than most people knew. And although Sakharov was one of the few who had some advance notice, he said nothing in print. Nothing anywhere that I could find, until Letter to the Leaders was published in its final form in 1974, soon after Solzhenitsyn was expelled from the Soviet Union. Sakharov published his critique of the letter. When Sakharov published his critique of the letter, Solzhenitsyn's descriptions of repressions, famine, terror, and imprisonment, he wrote, had affected Russian and non-Russian subjects of the Soviet state to the same extent, unquote. But non-Russians suffered even more than the Russians, also from forcible deportations, genocide, and the suppression of their culture, and this needed to be remembered. Sakharov felt, quote, "uneasy and dissatisfied" after reading the statements in Solzhenitsyn's letter. He said he was afraid of great Russian nationalism and considered the democratic path of development the only possible one for any country, but especially Russia. This, quote, "the servile slavish spirit which had existed in Russia for centuries, combined with a scorn for people of other countries, other races, and other beliefs, was alien to him, and he warned that Solzhenitsyn's more extreme proposals could prove dangerous, for ideologues, i.e. Solzhenitsyn, were always milder than the practical politicians who followed them." Curiously, in defending the rights and interests of non-Russians, Sakharov wrote what now reads like a prescription for 200 years together. Quote, "We must not forget," he wrote, "that each people in our country has its share of historical guilt as well as a sense of participation in our positive achievements, and that in any event, their fates will be closely intertwined for a long time to come. I wonder, in fact, if Solzhenitsyn possibly remembered these words unconsciously when he came to write 200 Years Together, although, of course, he adapted them to his own purposes. Well, I'd like to mention two more episodes in Solzhenitsyn's life before moving on to 200 Years Together. And by the way, the point of going to these different sections of Solzhenitsyn's life is to show the influences that brought him to the point of writing 200 Years Together. One of these episodes was farcical but rather interesting, one much more serious. The farcical episode occurred in the last years before Solzhenitsyn was expelled from the Soviet Union. The KGB were at their wits' ends on how to handle Solzhenitsyn, and they tried various ways to blacken his character. One of them was to spread the word and to spread rumors that Solzhenitsyn was actually a Jew, whose real name was Solzhenitsyn. Lydia Chukovskaya, in whose home Solzhenitsyn was staying during this time, later interviewed him about 200 Years Together. The interview, I haven't got it here, but it appeared in Moskovskaya Novosti, Russian news, and you can find it in English as well as Russian on the internet. Lydia Chukovskaya asked Solzhenitsyn if being called a Jew bothered him at all. Solzhenitsyn emphatically denied feeling upset or angry in any way, but the episode itself is interesting, I think, as an illustration of how deeply popular anti-Semitism had penetrated the Russian psychology, especially the psychology of the secret police. The second episode concerns the publication of Volume 2 of the Gulag Archipelago in 1977. Those of you who have read it may remember that Volume 2 contains, there are very, very few photographs or illustrations anywhere in the Gulag Archipelago. But in Volume 2, there are the photographs of 6 of the worst villains responsible for the excesses of the Gulag administration and their cruelty to the prisoners. Since there were so few, they immediately caught people's eyes, and it turned out that all 6 of the villains pictured were Jews. Solzhenitsyn argued that they were the only photographs he could find, and that they really exist, and that these people really existed. Well, that's no surprise. But his critics, rightly, weren't appeased. Obviously, there were far more Russians than Jews in charge of the Gulag, and it couldn't have been totally impossible to find their photographs. And surely it wasn't a coincidence that in that volume, Solzhenitsyn had laid so much emphasis on the misbehavior of the Jewish overseers among the Gulag administrators. This controversy then spread to other aspects of Solzhenitsyn's writings. His nationalism and deep love of orthodoxy and the Russian people seemed to suggest second-class status for non-Russians. Solzhenitsyn had also, and they also noted another, not exactly paradox, but another consideration. Solzhenitsyn, in many of his public statements, had been an outstanding supporter of the right of Russian Jews to emigrate. Once they were permitted to emigrate, when they were permitted to do so, starting in the 1970s by the Soviet authorities. But he conspicuously said nothing about the rights of the Jews who chose to stay, just as he had written very little about the persecutions of the Jews and the pogroms in pre-revolutionary Russia. Soon, his literary works were being examined for traces of anti-Semitism. The sheer absence of Jewish characters in A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and Cancer Ward was called unrealistic and suspicious. Even the 3 Jewish characters in the first circle were described as all negative. As I say, I don't think this is true of copulae of Rubin, but it certainly is of Reutemann and another prisoner, Isaac Kagan. Well, a debate ensued in which many Jews came to Solzhenitsyn's defense, especially when it came to his fictional and artistic works. The principal debate was actually carried by Jews who had emigrated either to Israel or to America, and who wrote at great length about this. Well, let me come now to 200 Years Together, which appeared in Russian, as I said, in 2001 and 2. I'm not going to analyze this book in any detail because I'm more concerned with the attitudes that led to it than its actual contents. They have been summarized and they have been analyzed in great detail elsewhere. But what I would like to point to is the controversy that arose from Solzhenitsyn's particular attitude to the Jews in Russia. Solzhenitsyn criticizes the Russian imperial state heavily, but he also notes the restriction of civil liberties of the Jews in Russia and the fact that their lives and property were not protected. But he also goes out of his way to claim that the pogroms were usually organized, quote, from below, by the masses, and not by the state authorities. And he also then goes on to heavily criticize the behavior of both Russians and Jews who joined the Bolsheviks during the October Revolution and its aftermath. He does, by the way, also mention the White Russian forces during the Civil War in southern Russia and the pogroms that they, too, sponsored. The other aspect of that book that led to much controversy was Solzhenitsyn's call for both Russians and Jews alike to take responsibility for the renegades, as he calls them, in both communities, who supported the establishment and the maintenance of the totalitarian regime, and insists that Jews must answer for the revolutionary zealots in their ranks, just as Russians may answer for theirs. Well, understanding the inflammable and explosive ground onto which he was stepping, and anticipating one line of criticism, Solzhenitsyn stated emphatically that he did not share the superstitious faith in conspiracy theories or the allegation that it was Jews who were responsible for the Russian Revolution. This, among other things, has led a number of Western critics, including Richard Pipes, Robert Service, and Jeffrey Hosking, along with their analyses of the book and their reviews, to absolve Solzhenitsyn of anti-Semitism, though Pipes is still very critical of some of Solzhenitsyn's mistakes and omissions. Well, I'm going to, since time is running out, jump to my conclusions about this. Or rather, to my question, why did Solzhenitsyn decide to write this book? Well, in her interview with Solzhenitsyn, Lydia Zhukovskaya didn't pose this question directly, but she came close. The premise of his book, she told him, seemed to be that it was morally vital to know the truth about Russians' relationship with the Jews. Quote, vital to whom, she asked? To history? To both nationalities? Solzhenitsyn evaded the question directly and said that any truth was morally vital, and that he added, I, for one, quote, felt entirely free, unrestrained, and confident that I was not causing the Jews any harm socially. Well, of course, the idea that Solzhenitsyn, sorry, did I say the other part? He did it, he also wrote it because it had become a subject that was last open to debate without prejudice. But I think that another reason may have been this. Solzhenitsyn had long since taken it on himself to be a kind of prophet for the Russian people and to take on the responsibility of putting forward proposals, ideas, even political programs. So, and he thought that he could bring a new perspective in that most of the books about this subject had been written by Jews themselves. He clearly knew, of course, that he was stepping into a hornet's nest when he undertook to write on it. And since obviously it's been a topic of debate for all 2 centuries the Jews were in Russia. But I would like to make, and I'm sorry, Jonathan, I have gone longer than I said, but this is the core of what I want to say. I think that this is a kind of defense of Solzhenitsyn. I think to understand his decision properly, you have to remember 2 things about writers or artists of any description. One is that they are in very many respects naive, and 2, they are fearless. And I would add 3, they are stubborn. Although I'm not claiming great art for 200 years together, I would like to suggest that there is a relationship here. I regard part of Solzhenitsyn's answer I regard Solzhenitsyn's answer to Zhukovskaya as an evasion. For the full truth about the Russians' relationship with the Jews was not to be revealed by a single book. And to the extent it was vital not in this case, not so much to history, nor to the 2 nationalities involved, but to Solzhenitsyn himself. Last page. In the end, he wrote this book because, in my view, he couldn't not write it, and he couldn't help doing so. In fact, I think it was a form of therapy, an attempt to come to terms with the populist and popular forms of anti-Semitism he had absorbed in southern Russia and couldn't fully shake off. And also, I think, a response to the criticisms he had experienced over the past 20 years in response to his works. This is why he went to the trouble of reading so many books, carefully footnoted all his sources. He boasted to Zhukovskaya that volume 2 of 200 Years contained over 1,500 footnotes, and his wife, Natalia, had delayed publication to check every single one. To my mind, this approach was a grievous mistake, and one I think that Solzhenitsyn himself realized when it was far too late. In that same interview, he mentioned that the true objective of his book was not, in fact, quote, not in fact scholarly, but artistic, unquote. It was basically, quote, an artistic work, and he had felt an affinity with his characters as if writing a work of fiction. Quote, as a matter of fact, he added, I had to restrain a writer's passion all the time because otherwise I would have broken the rule of using a great number of quotations, unquote. And further, quote, had I known how much effort this would require, I would never have started it. I had no idea how much hard work it would involve, unquote. So here we come to the crux of the matter. 200 years together is not the work of an artist, in fact, but neither is it the work of a true scholar, which is why I think the critics have been able to tear such big holes in it and identify the sources that a scholar would have known were suspect. I cannot help thinking what this book might have been had Solzhenitsyn stuck to the method he had used when writing the Gulag Archipelago, which on one level is a kind of expanded memoir. Solzhenitsyn put himself into the Gulag Archipelago and wrote as himself and described his own experiences along the way. If, in 200 years together, he had described his own experiences, confessed his frailties and failures, but also painted the unforgettable portraits he was capable of in describing both Jews and Russians along the way. He could have called on research as a prop to amplify his story, but not to use it as the main storyline. It's one of the great what-ifs of modern literature, if you like. Perhaps it is his age, something that was too much for him. Now, does this exonerate Solzhenitsyn of the charge of anti-Semitism? Well, the full truth, of course, is unknowable. But I believe that Solzhenitsyn's intentions in writing 200 Years Together, based on statements of friends and Jews who knew him at the time, were themselves honorable, and that many of his mistakes were the result of poor scholarship and inexperience of writing in this genre. Unfortunately, he could never quite throw off some of the popular prejudices he had absorbed in his youth, and this ambivalence permeated his work to the very end. I like to think that had he been able to write a genuine memoir, he might have purged himself of those prejudices and earned a very different reception for his book.
How to make it work on the screen?
Just pull your PowerPoint up and then I'll turn it on.
All right. Extensive literature about Stalinist anti-Semitism examines usually political acts, campaigns, repressions, and the like. However, these acts were always bashfully half-hidden. Their rationales and motives not only were not documented, they were not even articulated. Therefore, what has been perceived, what has been preserved in public texts, from newspaper satires telling about omnipresent Jews who were rogues and troublemakers, to literary works where a Jewish conspiracy would sometimes take an universal scope, is the only thing that has preserved for us the character of Stalinist anti-Semitism, not only as a political instrument, but also as a sort of essential imaginary phenomenon meant for mass consumption. To designate the Jewish enemy, late Stalinist propaganda, and I talk about post-war Stalinist period, late Stalinist propaganda used definitions that were formally neutral, but which evoked the necessary associations. The conspiracy rhetoric that permeated Soviet press was a direct reflection of the social tension that the regime artificially produced by uncovering one conspiracy after another. Such Jewish conspiracy as a master plot was rarely explicit in Soviet art, as it was in Nazi propaganda. But the fact that the very word Jews was taboo implied a kind of collusion between the regime and the population. The population had to be able to decode the anti-Semitic message and understand why it could not be explicit. As a result, the conspiracy was not only a plot, but produced a sort of conspiratorial style. Soviet Jews in 1940s found themselves between the hammer of Nazism and the anvil of Stalinism. It is telling that the conspiratorial logical delirium that Stalin dwelt in after the war led him to the very same opening idea that Hitler had formulated, calling Jews conspirators and universal poisoners. In its final core, the conspiracy of the murderer doctors, Stalinism arrived at the concrete materialization of this Nazi metaphor. In this respect, late Stalinism, in which anti-Semitism was instrumentalized, institutionalized, and transformed into a systematic phenomenon, there was neither a peculiar nor a mild form of anti-Semitism, as some historians assert. Its mildness, as compared to the Holocaust, lay only in the fact that it was cut short by Stalin's sudden death. The peculiarity of Stalinist anti-Semitism is defined by its being tabooed, which was the result of political ideological restrictions that were weakened before one's very eyes. The argument of those who claim that Stalinist anti-Semitic propaganda was a mild and restrained boils down to the fact that the Soviet culture did not produce anything equal to, for instance, Jude Zeus, the masterpiece of Nazi anti-Semitic propaganda. I would argue that it did, in fact, produce a theatrical equivalent to a Fate Harlan film. It's Vladimir Solovyov now utterly forgotten play, The Golden Plague, or Betrayal of a Nation. The fact that it was a play and the stage production, not a film, nor a novel or poem, contributed to the fact that it was firmly forgotten. Short-lived theatrical productions simply cannot be properly preserved and analyzed as film or literary text. However, it is interesting as a demonstration that by the beginning of the 1950s, Stalinist anti-Semitic propaganda practically arrived at the Nazi propaganda pattern of the late 30s. The Golden Plague was about the Paris Commune, one of the favorite subjects of Soviet art. From the great number of novels, poems, paintings, and monuments to such films as Grigory Kozintsev and Leonid Trauberg's New Babylon, and Grigory Rochald's Paris Dawns, and Boris Astafiev's ballet Paris Flame. This subject contained a whole collection of socialist realist effects: the triumph of a people in revolt, the tragedy of proletariat's liberating struggle, the treachery, and the boundless cruelty of the doomed classes. But Solovyov's plays were so radically distinguished in this torrent of works that it requires separate separate attention and very interesting in this sense. Essentially, the Paris Commune in it was merely a backdrop. At its heart lay the idea that of a conspiracy and its dramatization. All of its action took place in the offices of bankers, and the Rothschilds were at the center of the conspiracy. All the other characters, communards and not present on the stage inhabitants of Versailles or Bismarck, are depicted as mere Rothschilds puppets. Instead of class struggle, the explanatory factor of for historical events became banking operations and schemes. And I have to say, Solovyov wrote all his plays in verses. He was a poet, sort of. Solovyov continued the traditions of a left-wing anti-Semitism, that of the so-called socialism of fools, the term coined by Franz Mehring. Born in Vienna in the late 19th century, when some socialist leaders began to preach a struggle against Jewish bankers, and world Jewish capital, or rather instead of class struggle. Many social democrats made fun of this variety of socialism of fools, but when fascism came to replace the European socialist movement and National Socialism combined rightist anti-Semitism and racial theory with the class struggle of leftist radicals and Jews, the result was the Holocaust. After the war, socialism of fool disappeared from European politics for a while, returning to it only in the late 60s, along with the support for the national liberation movements and later with anti-globalism. It was in just this interval of the first post-war years that Stalinist regime took up the baton of leftist anti-Semitism, declaring war on ruthless cosmopolitans and world Zionism. Since interpreting a history through a Jewish conspiracy was something absolutely new for Soviet readers, the author of its foreword, the prominent Soviet historian of France, Alexander Moloch, tried to legitimize Solovyov's approach to history with a reference to Marx. Although Marx felt no sympathy, as we know, to Jewish bankers, he was not inclined to view history from the office windows of Rothschilds bank. It goes without saying that from this perspective, Thiers was a secondary figure. Furthermore, politics itself, when confronted with Jewish money, descended into the background. Thus, the main historical figures retreated into the shadows and Jewish bankers emerged from them. Accordingly, racist conspiratology replaced class struggle. Therefore, least readers get distracted from the present time. Moloch, the author of this introduction to this play, reminded them that the, and I quote, incriminatory zeal of the play focused not only against the 1871 French bankers, but also against today's Wall Street sharks, against all of today's imperialism, achieves its great power in the images of Rothschild. That is, he pointed out that the conspiracy of Jewish bankers was by no means a history, but the underlying cause of the Cold War. From the very first scene, the play draws the viewer into a world of conspiracy. The revolutionary leader of the Paris Commune, Rigaud, linked this conspiracy to Jewish bankers. I will quote it in Russian so you can appreciate the elegance of this poetic production with the translation projected on the screen. So, Rigaud. Воюют Франция и Пруссия, а в тайне на биржах спор идет, кто победит всерьез, дом Ротшильдов во Франкфурте на Майне или дом Ротшильдов в Париже? Вот вопрос. Here the viewer is initiated into the secret of cosmopolitanism. Банкир, он может жить в любой столице мира, на родине своей или в чужой осев. Вам интересно знать, где родина банкира? Я вам отвечу, там, где он поставил сейф. Нет, Франция еще не поднялась. Для Франции не Ротшильды основа. Когда лишь сам народ осуществляет власть, тогда он нация в великом смысле слова. In accordance with this logic, Jews are not a nation, not even part of the other nations. France and Prussia are the victims of a real, secret war unleashed by the Rothschilds and Blackrothers to get rich. From this perspective, a union of France and Prussia against the cosmopolitan Rothschilds would be a manifestation of internationalism. The cosmopolitanism of Jewish capital is contrasted to a peculiar international of anti-Semites. This anti-cosmopolitan international is quite remote from traditional nationalism and has a decidedly internationalist aspect. Different countries have different enemies, but they all have one enemy in common: international Jewish capital. So, as not to confuse bourgeois cosmopolitanism with proletarian internationalism, Solovyov introduces the character of a doubting communard, Clement, who erupts in questions, and I quote: «Что ж, только буржуа одни космополиты, и только золото с чужой землей роднит? Ну а Домбровский, друг наш знаменитый, ведь он же не богат, но он космополит. Он, бросив родины, свободу шел навстречу и новую нашел в одной из многих стран». Dombrovsky himself immediately appears on the scene and delivers a long monologue in which he confesses: «Свое отечество ношу с собою в сердце, и ту страну, что мне дает приют порой, не называю родиной второй. Есть родина своя у каждого народа, и кто народу служит, тот, где б ни был он, средь дальнего похода, в изгнании, сердцем, где его народ». Thus, the idea of internationalism is alien to Dombrowski, portrayed in a play. His heart is fully devoted to the motherland. It is another story with the Jewish bourgeoisie. Голос Родины для золота неведом, оно безродное, оно то тут, то там. И тот, кто служит золоту, тот следом за этим золотом и ходит по пятам. Кто служит золоту, у тех его природа, и нет у них ни дома, ни родни, они как золото безродны, и вместе по миру шатаются они. Нет, между нами сходства я не вижу, о разном грезим мы во сне и наяву. Ваш Ротшильд не француз, хоть он живет в Париже, а я поляк, хоть в Польше не живу. Грибоедов. With the stigma ruthless, безродный, the portrait of the Jew is complete. And although the Polish nationalist and leftist adventurer Dombrowski has nothing to do with proletariat internationalism, the main thing is that Rothschild is defined as his chief enemy. The play consists of detailed explanations in poetic form of cynical financial machinations through which the Jewish banking houses of the Rothschilds and Blackrodders unleashed a war between France and Prussia. And then how, using this money, they strangled the Paris Commune. All these details were needed in order to show and explain how France is being sold and what the Jewish conspiracy is. Given this approach to history, public power is not worth anything, and not only in the past, but also in the projected onto the present. The lack of publicity of Jewish conspirators in the past had to be explained by the omnipotence of Jews in the Soviet present, when they had become practically invisible in early 50s. As we know, Jewish theaters, schools, and press agencies were closed. Jews were removed from all government posts that were at all important. There were no Jews among the widely publicized war heroes, shock workers, or cultural figures. On the contrary, their participation in the war was diminished in every possible way. Their enormous contribution to science and to the creation of the Soviet military potential was classified, and Jewish surnames in popular consciousness were almost exclusively associated with anti-patriotism, speculation, and theft. which was facilitated by the campaign in the press. In the early 50s, when in connection with the Jewish anti-fascist committee and the doctor's plot, the anti-Semitic campaign reached a culmination, there was a need to explain how such a marginalized part of the population could be so socially harmful and dangerous. The plot provided an answer to this question. The issue was conspiracy. Zionist spies in the Jewish anti-fascist committee, Cosmopolitans, critics, murderers, doctors, etc., etc. The mix of cynicism and histrionics that permeates the play reaches its apex in the ending. On the eve of the trial of the communard Genton, the newspapers are breathless in their gratitude to Rothschild, who gave the government a loan. But in Genton's last word at the trial sounds like a final scene of Jude Zeus. I don't know, probably some in this audience watched this horrendous film. And I quote, «Но есть сироты, матери и вдовы, которым я хочу сознаться в смертный час, как перед ними мы виновны в сторону присутствующих на заседании судей зрителей, за то, что мы не расстреляли вас. Да, видно, были мы доверчивы, как дети, поскольку даже в вас мы видели людей. Мы пощадили вас, из ваших нор не выгнав, мы вас щадили даже от оков, а надо было вас уничтожать, как тигров, душить, как змей, давить, как пауков». The very existence of the commune, according to Genton, is a lesson to their descendants that enemies deserved destruction. Но даже наша кровь, текущая потоком, пусть всей вашей вины не смоет с нас, чтобы видели ее, чтобы не пришлось потомкам ее оплачивать и в следующий раз. It is telling, I'm almost at the end of this fascinating work, it is telling that the enemy, as they are portrayed here, are not so much class enemies at all as national ones. They are the enemy of the people who here are by no means understood in any class sense. All the old anti-Semitic stereotypes are used here to depicting them: greed, bloody money, unleashing wars, and the destructive forces of rootless capital, calling for the destruction of, and I quote, it's all from this monologue, «вас, покупающий дешевый пот народа, платящих золотом за кровь, смотрящих лишь как на статьи дохода, на честь, на совесть и любовь». Genton constantly returns to the theme of national betrayal. Не только Францию вы продали позорно, за ваше золото от жадности своей, вы собственным отцам перегрызете горло и предадите собственных детей. These people are destroying the future. Сады цветущие вы превратите в пепел, дома в золу и все живое в прах. But they have no past as well. По земле, зато ваш каждый шаг отмечен кровавым пиром золотой чумы. Having completely dehumanized the enemy, deprived them of a past and future, and called them the enemy of a human race and beasts, Solovyov concludes the play with Genton's monologue, which threatens the enemy with complete annihilation. И те, которых вы при помощи железа, воочию показав звериный облик свой, вогнали в землю перлашеза, лекли фундаментом коммуны мировой. Вы жизни их не вытравили в жизни, ни привидением, ни в полуночной мгле. Они вам явятся, но призрак коммунизма напомнит вам их лица на земле. Сегодня с Франции проценты вы возьмете за вашу помощь собственной стране, но час пробьет в конечном счете, мы с вас за нашу кровь получим их втройне. This invective, curses and bloodthirsty calls for carnage thundered against the conspirators, all of them Jews, in a play, from the pages of a journal and the book and the boards of theaters. Just at the end of 1952, at the beginning of 1953, when the anti-Semitic hysteria reached its limits, and new Jewish conspirators, this time murderers, doctors, replaced the house of Rothschild in the black art of tireless Zionist conspiracies. But with Stalin's death, the usual Zionist conspiracy went bankrupt. A few months after its premiere, and it was staged in Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev, and in preparation in some other provincial provincial cities. A few months after its premiere, the play was removed from the repertoire and banned, hardly coincidentally, on April 6, 1953, the day when Pravda published an editorial where the charges against the doctors were dismissed. Thank you. Well, I hope it was at least entertaining.
Oh, it was
by the end of the day.
I know we would all like to have a question-answer period now, but I've been informed that our hosts, Marivana, have got to be out of this building by 6:30. So let's reserve our questions for our vodka and herring. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.